This video is part 2 of the brain and central nervous system. Deep within the cerebrum, we find these kind of dark masses called the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei. These dark masses are just kind of groups of cell bodies. The basal ganglia are really important because they inhibit unnecessary movements, and they also modulate stereotyped movements. So inhibiting unnecessary movements means to kind of like makes the movements kind of more smooth. And stereotyped movements are movements that people do that don't necessarily have a purpose. And so this is seen really often in young children, and as we get older, they kind of get less and less, but include things like rocking, or thumb sucking, sometimes head banging. The basal ganglia are also important in cognition and emotion. One of the ways I like to explain or demonstrate some of the controls that the basal ganglia have are to talk about the effects of having diseased basal ganglia. And so Parkinson's and Huntington's disease both affect the basal ganglia, and most of us are familiar with kind of the tremors that occur with Parkinson's and the kind of discordant walking patterns. And so by looking at somebody with Parkinson's disease, knowing that it affects the basal ganglia, I think most of us are able to apply what is happening with somebody who has Parkinson's disease to the decreased function of the basal ganglia. So when somebody has Parkinson's, that tremor is because their body is no longer able to inhibit those unnecessary movements or modulate the stereotyped movements. The next area of the brain we're going to talk about is called the diencephalon. And the diencephalon includes the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is an important relay between between the spinal cord and the rest of the brain. So information comes in, much of it is going to go to the thalamus before it's sent to different areas of the cortex. The epithalamus, the key part of the epithalamus is the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin. And melatonin is involved in controlling our sleep and wake cycles. And the biggest kind of function of the structures in the diencephalon comes with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is also known as the homeostatic control center. It controls the autonomic nervous system, and so it's involved with the physical response to emotions. It controls major parts of the endocrine system, and it actually has a direct tie between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland by this stalk that's called the infundibulum. It controls heart rate, blood pressure, water balance, ionic balance, thirst, hunger, temperature, digestion. The hypothalamus controls it all. We're going to move from the diencephalon to the brainstem. And the brainstem has some overlapping functions with the hypothalamus that we just talked about. But the brainstem is an extension of the spinal cord, but unlike the spinal cord, it has kind of these additional masses of cell bodies or nuclei found within the white matter. And so the brainstem controls our really basic survival needs. And so the brainstem is found throughout vertebrates, right? A very similar brainstem. So while the cerebrum is very different, humans have a very large cerebrum compared to other animals, but the brainstem is pretty consistent. The brainstem is going to include the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain, which is up here, includes some visual reflex centers. It's an auditory relay, and it's also involved in suppressing the fight or flight response. Okay, so the fight or flight response we'll talk about more when we get into the autonomic nervous system, but most of us have an idea of what that is. When you're scared or when you're in danger and you feel your heart racing, that is the fight or flight response. And we also have some other nuclei found here called the substantia nigra, which is just the dark substance. The pons controls sleep, it controls bladder, breathing, swallowing, and hearing. And then the medulla oblongata controls many autonomic reflexes, and this is where we see a lot of overlap with the hypothalamus. The medulla oblongata has a cardiovascular center that controls heart rate, force of contraction, and the diameter of our blood vessels, has a respiration center which controls rhythm, the rate of breath, and the depth of breath through the pontine centers. In addition, it controls things like vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. The last of the major parts of the brain that we're going to talk about is the cerebellum, which is found back here. It forms about 10% of the mass of the brain, and it's really important in processing information and coordinating response. Okay, so the cerebellum smooths out our muscle actions. It helps with balance. It's also active in thinking, language, and emotion. Talking about emotion is a great segue into the emotional system, which is called the limbic system. So the limbic system is largely thought of as a functional system because it's the areas that are really involved with emotion, which are all kind of close together but include different structures. The limbic system connects emotion to events and experience. It's involved in forming long-lasting memories, and interestingly enough, it's connected with olfaction. So olfaction is smelling. And the way that it's easy to kind of demonstrate that connection is think about a family meal. In our house, one of our favorite meals is albondigas soup. It's a Mexican meatball soup. And just smelling the tomatoes and the ground beef and the cumin in there makes all of us feel like we're home. Okay, and so that's that really olfactory connection to an emotional experience. And I think all of us have that, have some sort of olfactory connection to emotion. And so that's why you can close your eyes and imagine the smell of somebody that you've dated or the smell of your child as a newborn. These things are very, very closely tied together. There are many parts that are involved in the limbic system, but I'm going to talk about just a few of them. So the fornix, which forms the inferior border of the lateral ventricle, the fornix are the fibers that connect the different parts of the limbic system. Above the corpus callosum, the superior part of the lateral ventricle, is an area called the singular gyrus. And this is involved in processing emotion and behavior. And it seems to be involved when people have schizophrenia, and there's something different happening in the singular gyrus. We have the hippocampus, which is the area that deals with spatial memory and learning. And then there's the amygdaloid body. And the amygdaloid body is right in this area right here. It's also called the amygdala. And that is involved with attention, emotion, social processing. So when I say social processing, I'm talking about you look at somebody and you interpret what their face is saying. Is there fear showing in their face? Is there anger showing in their face? Those types of things. The amygdaloid body also is the kind of location of autobiographical memory about yourself. And another area that I would like to talk about is called the reticular formation. The reticular formation are nuclei that's found deep in the brainstem. And the important part about this is that there's an area called the reticular activating system. And this reticular activating system, or the RAS, sends kind of regular impulses to your cerebral cortex. And it keeps your cerebral cortex awake. It also filters out a huge amount of stimuli. About 99% of the stimulus that comes in to your brain gets filtered out. It's not needed. And this reticular activating system is affected by alcohol, drugs, and the sleep centers of your brain. I just want to hang out over here with the alcohol and the drugs for a little bit. When people are taking in alcohol and some drugs, they often get sleepy, sometimes pass out. And it's because of the effect that they have on the reticular activating system. So supporting this very large brain that we have is cerebral spinal fluid. The fluid surrounds our brain, cushioning it from any injury, and it also reduces the weight of the brain. So think about when you're in a pool, you're more buoyant, right? So you weigh less. The cerebral spinal fluid reduces the weight of the brain by 97%. And it also brings important nutrients and chemical signals inside the brain. The cerebral spinal fluid travels through the ventricles, down through the central canal of the spinal cord, up and around the brain. It's formed by capillaries that are found in the ventricles. So the capillary beds are called choroid plexuses. One choroid plexus, more than one choroid plexuses. And so the capillaries, like all capillaries, are going to push plasma out of the capillary walls. So the blood cells stay in, but the plasma gets forced out. The plasma that gets forced out of the choroid plexus is then going to be filtered and kind of adjusted by the ependymal cells, those epithelial cells that we see in the central nervous system. Okay, so when that plasma goes through the ependymal cells, it's going to go through a really strict filtering process, and the ion concentrations are going to be adjusted, right? Because it's very important to maintain the proper ion concentrations around neurons so that we don't have inappropriate action potentials. The ependymal cells can also remove waste from the plasma. Then once that filtrate gets released as cerebral spinal fluid into the ventricles, the cilia of the ependymal cells is going to help move that cerebral spinal fluid around. Another control on what the brain is exposed to is through the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier allows the area around the brain to be maintained as a pretty stable environment. It prevents accidental action potentials, and it's a very selective filter. And this selective filter stops metabolic wastes, proteins, toxins, most drugs, small non-essential amino acids, and potassium from reaching the brain, or most parts of the brain. But it allows fat-soluble substances, and that includes alcohol, nicotine, and anesthetics. In addition, some nutrients are able to pass the blood-brain barrier through facilitated diffusion. The blood-brain barrier is not found in all areas of the brain. Areas that need to monitor chemical information or the temperature of the blood do not have a blood-brain barrier, like the vomiting center and the hypothalamus. But the majority of the brain does have this protection. The blood-brain barrier is formed by 3 layers. So there's a continuous layer of epithelium along the capillary walls, and that epithelium has really, really tight junctions that make it virtually impossible for anything to go through. There's a thick basal lamina that's found around the capillaries. And then we can see, so these are astrocytes. Remember those astrocytes? And these are the feet of those astrocytes. And so astrocytes at the end of their branches have these kind of podocytes, or these little feet. that surrounds the neurons. Okay, so the combination of these three barriers is what allows the blood-brain barrier to be such an effective filter. This effective filter is great almost all the time, except for when you need to get medication into the brain. If somebody has an infection, it can be really hard to get medication that can pass that blood-brain barrier and get to the area that has infection. I'm going to wrap up today's discussion with talking about the neuronal pathways that go through the spinal cord. And neuronal pathways have four characteristics in common. The first is decussation. Decussation is the moving of information from the right side to the left side. And that happens in almost all of the pathways of the spinal cord. There's also relay, where signals get relayed from one neuron to another. Somatotropy is that the different regions of the body can be mapped along these pathways. And symmetry, so the right side of the spinal cord and the left side of the spinal cord are symmetrical. If a pathway is ascending, it's bringing information from sensory neurons up to the brain. And if it's descending, it's taking information with motor commands away from the brain to the muscles and the glands. So let's look at the ascending pathway first. And again, this is the sensory information. So the first order neurons of the sensory pathway are the receptors. Whether these are cutaneous receptors or proprioceptors, they are the sensory neurons that are bringing information in. Once that information gets into the spinal cord or even all the way up to the medulla, that information needs to be sent to the appropriate places. So those sensory neurons, that once they get into the central nervous system, can have quite a bit of branching to make sure that that information gets to the right parts of the brain. The next neuron is going to be the second order interneuron. So an interneuron is found within the spinal cord or within the medulla. And the second order neurons are going to reach out to the thalamus and the cerebellum. And so from there, we know that the thalamus is a relay. So we have third order neurons, another interneuron, that has its cell body in the thalamus, and it's going to send signals to the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so the first order neurons are the sensory neurons. They're going to send the signal into the spinal cord or the medulla. The second order neurons are interneurons. And those interneurons are either going to send a signal to the thalamus or the cerebellum. And then we have our third order neurons for the information that's been sent to the thalamus. The third order neurons are going to have bodies in the thalamus, and they're going to send their signals to the somatosensory cortex. So there are two major pathways that send information to the thalamus. And this information is going to allow for discriminatory touch and conscious proprioception. So, discriminatory touch, you can understand where and what you're feeling. Conscious proprioception, where the body is in space. And so we have the dorsal column, medial lemniscal pathways, and these sense touch and vibration. And the other pathway is called the spinal thalamic or anterolateral system, and this is for pain, temperature, coarse touch, and pressure. So those were the two pathways that send information to the thalamus and then ultimately to the sensory cortex. The spinal cerebellar tracts are what send the signal or information to the cerebellum. And so this is going to be information about muscle and tendon stretch. So we've talked about how the cerebellum kind of smooths out movements and coordinates and movements and balance. And so it's really important that the muscle and tendon stretch information gets to the cerebellum. The descending pathways are going to be motor commands. And there's going to be what we call pyramidal tracts and extrapyramidal tracts. Pyramidal tracts regulate very fast, finely controlled movements, and extrapyramidal tracts are more maintenance movements, so posture, balance, and the control of large movements of the limbs, head, neck, and eye. I hope you found these videos helpful. All of the source material for images are from open source, Creative Commons licensed or public domain images, and their data are here. If you have any further questions, please post to the Community Help Forum, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.